The envelope was taped to my apartment door when I got home from work on a Tuesday evening. Not slipped under the door like a normal notice. Not placed in my mailbox like every other piece of correspondence I'd received in the 3 years I'd lived in this building. Taped directly to the door at eye level, impossible to miss, designed to maximize humiliation for anyone walking past who might see it. The envelope was manila, legal-sized, with eviction notice, typed in aggressive all caps across the front. My name, Jasmine Reeves, was handwritten below it in black marker, the letters slanted and angry-looking. I stood in the hallway of my apartment building in Brooklyn, still wearing my work clothes, holding my leather tote bag and a container of pad thai I'd picked up on the walk from the subway, staring at this envelope like it might explode if I touched it. Around me, the building hummed with the normal sounds of early evening, someone's TV playing the news, a couple arguing in Spanish 3 floors up, the distinctive smell of Mrs. Chen's cooking from 4B wafting through the hallway. This was my home. I'd lived here for 3 years, paid my rent on time every single month, usually 5 days early. Never caused problems, never complained about the ancient plumbing or the radiator that clanked like a percussion section, or the way the elevator broke down at least once a month. I was a model tenant, and now there was an eviction notice on my door. I pulled the envelope off, the tape leaving a sticky residue on the painted wood, and carried it inside my apartment. Set down my dinner and my bag. Opened the envelope with shaking hands. The notice inside was printed on official-looking letterhead. Law Offices of Berkowitz and Stein, Attorneys at Law. It was addressed to me and dated today, October 15th, and it informed me, in cold legal language, that I was being evicted from apartment 6D at 247 Monroe Street, Brooklyn, New York, for violating the terms of my lease agreement. I had 30 days to vacate the premises or face legal action. The reason for eviction was listed as unauthorized occupancy by individuals not named on the lease agreement, in violation of Section 4.3 of the Residential Lease Agreement dated September 1st, 2021. I read it 3 times, trying to make sense of it. Unauthorized occupancy? I lived alone. I'd always lived alone. There was no one else in this apartment except me. What the hell was my landlord talking about? My landlord, Richard Castellano, 63 years old, owned this building and 3 others in the neighborhood, wore cheap suits, and drove a Mercedes that cost more than most people made in 2 years. I'd dealt with him exactly 4 times in 3 years. When I signed the lease, when I renewed it twice, and once when the ceiling in my bathroom started leaking and I'd called to request repairs. He'd been dismissive during that last interaction, had sent his superintendent to slap some spackle on the leak without actually fixing the underlying problem. The ceiling still had water stains, but he'd never had any issues with me as a tenant. I paid rent on time. I didn't cause problems. I worked in finance, had a stable job, was exactly the kind of tenant landlords supposedly wanted. So why was he trying to evict me now? I pulled out my phone and called him. It rang 4 times before going to voicemail. His message was curt. "You've reached Richard Castellano. Leave a message." I didn't leave one. Instead, I texted him. "I just received an eviction notice. Please call me immediately. There must be some mistake." While I waited for a response that didn't come, I dug out my lease agreement from the filing cabinet where I kept all my important documents. Read through Section 4.3 carefully. It stated that the apartment could only be occupied by individuals named on the lease agreement, and that any additional occupants required written approval from the landlord. The only name on my lease was mine, Jasmine Reeves. Just me. So unless Richard Castellano thought I was harboring secret roommates, this eviction notice made absolutely no sense. Unless a cold feeling started spreading through my chest. Unless he'd somehow found out about the trust. My name is Jasmine Reeves, but that's not the whole story. I'm 31 years old, born and raised in Detroit, Michigan, the daughter of parents who worked factory jobs their entire lives and died within 6 months of each other when I was 23. They left me everything they had, which wasn't much. About $80,000 in life insurance and savings combined. I was devastated by their deaths. Lost. Angry at the world. But I was also practical, a trait my father had instilled in me from childhood. So I took that $80,000 and I made something of it. I put myself through the last year of college at Wayne State, got a job at a financial services firm in Detroit, learned everything I could about investing, about building wealth, about making money work for you instead of just working for money. And I invested that $80,000. Carefully, conservatively at first, then more aggressively as I learned more and gained confidence. By the time I was 26, I'd turned it into $300,000. By 28, it was close to $1 million. And now, at 31, I had a portfolio worth just over $4 million. $4 million that almost no one knew about. I'd learned early that having money made you a target. People treated you differently when they knew you had wealth. Some wanted to use you, to get access to your resources. Some resented you, thought you didn't deserve it or hadn't earned it. Some wanted to sell you things, to separate you from your money through investments or business opportunities, or just plain scams. So I'd kept my wealth private. I still worked my job at the financial firm, making a respectable but not extraordinary $90,000 a year. I lived in this modest one-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn that cost me $2,000 a month. I took the subway. I bought my clothes at normal stores, not designer boutiques. I lived like someone who made $90,000 a year, not someone who had $4 million in investments. But I'd also done something smart, something my financial advisor had recommended. I'd put all my assets into a trust, the Reeves Family Trust, established 3 years ago when I'd moved to New York. The trust owned my investment portfolio. The trust had its own tax ID number, and the trust, not me personally, was listed as the actual leaseholder on certain important documents, including riders and addendums to my apartment lease. I'd done this for asset protection. If I ever got sued, if something catastrophic happened, my personal assets would be shielded because they were technically owned by the trust, not by me individually. It was a common wealth preservation strategy. My financial advisor had insisted on it. And when I'd signed my apartment lease 3 years ago, my lawyer had insisted on adding a rider to the lease. A rider that specified that while the primary lease was in my name for simplicity, the trust was the actual beneficial interest holder and had all the rights and privileges of a leaseholder under New York rental law. I'd signed the rider. My landlord, Richard Castellano, had signed it. It was attached to my lease, a legally binding addendum that I'd honestly forgotten about because it had never mattered in the 3 years I'd lived here. Until now. I pulled out the full lease packet, flipping past the standard lease agreement to the rider at the back. There it was. Lease rider, beneficial interest disclosure. It stated clearly that Jasmine Reeves was the named tenant and occupant, but that the Reeves Family Trust held the beneficial interest in the lease and had the right to enforce all terms, conditions, and protections afforded to residential tenants under New York law. Richard Castellano's signature was right there at the bottom, dated September 1st, 3 years ago. He'd signed it. He'd agreed to it. He knew about the trust. So why was he now trying to evict me for unauthorized occupancy? I called him again. Voicemail again. This time I left a message. Mr. Castellano, this is Jasmine Reeves in apartment 6D. I received your eviction notice and I need to discuss it with you immediately. There's been a significant misunderstanding. Please call me back tonight. He didn't call back. By 9 p.m. I was angry. By 10 p.m., I was furious. By 11 p.m., I'd made a decision. I was going to fight this. And I was going to win. If you're listening to this story and you're wondering how a landlord could try to illegally evict a tenant, and what happened when that tenant fought back with resources he didn't know she had, stay with me, because this is just the beginning. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what unfolded over the next few weeks taught me lessons about power, about standing up for yourself, and about why you should never underestimate someone just because they seem like they don't have options. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I wasn't actually sick, but I needed time to deal with this situation. I made coffee, sat at my small kitchen table, and started making calls. First call, my lawyer. Her name was Patricia Song, and she specialized in real estate law. I'd hired her 3 years ago to review my lease before I signed it, and she was the one who'd recommended adding the trust rider. She answered on the third ring. Jasmine, I haven't heard from you in ages. How's the apartment? About to become a legal battleground, apparently. I need your help. I explained about the eviction notice, about the claim of unauthorized occupancy, about Richard Castellano refusing to return my calls. Patricia listened without interrupting, and I could hear her typing notes. Okay, she said when I finished. First things first, this eviction notice is bullshit. Legally, procedurally, factually, it's complete bullshit. You have a valid lease. You're the named tenant. You occupy the apartment alone. There's no unauthorized occupancy happening. This is what we call a wrongful eviction attempt. So what do? You respond in writing, citing the lease terms and New York tenant protection laws. You document everything, and you prepare for him to escalate this, because landlords who send frivolous eviction notices usually have ulterior motives. What kind of ulterior motives? Could be anything. Maybe he wants you out so he can rent the apartment for more money. Maybe he's selling the building and wants it vacant. Maybe you pissed him off somehow and this is retaliation. Could also be that he's trying to clear out tenants with beneficial interest riders because those riders give you more legal protections than standard tenants have. More protections how? Well, for one thing, the trust rider means you can't be evicted without the trust's consent. And since you control the trust, that effectively means you can't be evicted without your own consent, as long as you're meeting the terms of the lease. It also means that any attempt to evict you has to go through much more rigorous legal scrutiny because the trust has standing to sue on its own behalf. So I'm harder to push around. Exactly. Which is why I'm betting that's what this is about. Castellano probably wants to get rid of tenants who have these kinds of protections. Easier to push around people who don't understand their rights. He picked the wrong tenant to mess with. He really did. Okay, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to draft a formal response to this eviction notice. I'm going to cite every relevant section of New York tenant law. I'm going to reference the lease rider and the trust's beneficial interest. And I'm going to inform him that any further harassment will result in legal action for wrongful eviction, which carries significant penalties under New York law. How significant? Significant enough to hurt. If we can prove he's trying to wrongfully evict you, you can sue for damages, moving costs, emotional distress, and attorney's fees. Plus potential punitive damages if we can show the eviction attempt was particularly egregious, or in bad faith. How much are we talking? Depends on what we can prove. But it's not uncommon for wrongful eviction suits to settle for $50,000 to $100,000. Sometimes more. I felt a grim satisfaction at that number. Richard Castellano thought he was pushing around a young woman who wouldn't fight back. He was about to discover how wrong he was. Draw up the response. Make it as legally intimidating as possible. I want him to understand that I know my rights and I'm prepared to defend them. Consider it done. I'll have it to you by this afternoon. Second call. My financial advisor, Robert Chen. Robert managed my investment portfolio and had helped me structure the trust. He needed to know what was happening in case the situation escalated, and we needed to take corporate action on behalf of the trust. Jasmine, good morning. What can I do for you? Someone's trying to evict me from my apartment. I need to make sure the trust is ready to fight this if necessary. I explained the situation. Robert was quiet for a moment after I finished. This is interesting. Your landlord is trying to evict you without realizing that you have significant resources to fight back. That's a tactical error on his part. That's what my lawyer said. Here's what I recommend. Make sure Patricia includes language in her response that makes it clear the trust is prepared to pursue all legal remedies, including litigation that could extend for years if necessary. Make it clear that you have the resources for a prolonged legal battle. Won't that reveal that I have money? Not if we word it carefully. We don't have to disclose the trust's assets. We just have to make it clear that the trust has sufficient resources to defend its interests. Most landlords back down when they realize they're dealing with someone who can afford good lawyers and long court battles. Okay, I'll have Patricia include that language. Also, Jasmine, this might be a good time to start documenting everything about your tenancy. Every payment you've made, every interaction you've had with Castellano, every repair request, everything. If this goes to court, you want a complete record showing you've been an exemplary tenant. I'll start pulling that together today. By noon, I had 3 years of rent receipts organized chronologically, copies of every email exchange with Richard Castellano or his property manager, photos I'd taken of apartment issues, the leaking ceiling, the broken stove that took 3 weeks to replace, the lobby door that didn't lock properly for 6 months, a timeline of every significant event related to my tenancy. I was building a case, not just to defend against the eviction, but to establish that Richard Castellano was a negligent landlord who was now retaliating against a good tenant for reasons that had nothing to do with actual lease violations. Patricia's response letter arrived at 3 p.m. It was 6 pages long, single-spaced, dense with legal citations. I read through it carefully, feeling a savage satisfaction with every paragraph. The letter began by stating that the eviction notice was without legal merit and violated multiple provisions of New York tenant protection law. It cited the lease agreement, the trust rider, and specific statutes that protected tenants from wrongful eviction. It detailed my exemplary tenancy record, 3 years of on-time rent payments, no complaints from neighbors, no lease violations of any kind. Then it got more aggressive. It stated that the eviction notice appeared to be in bad faith and possibly retaliatory in nature. It noted that there was no legitimate basis for the claim of unauthorized occupancy, and that making such a claim when the landlord knew it to be false could constitute fraud. It warned that any further attempts to evict me without legitimate cause would result in legal action for wrongful eviction, harassment, and constructive eviction. And then came the paragraph I loved most. Please be advised that the Reeves Family Trust, as the beneficial interest holder in the lease agreement for Apartment 6D, has significant resources available to defend its interests and pursue all available legal remedies. The trust is prepared to engage in protracted litigation if necessary to protect the rights of its beneficiaries. Any attempts to improperly terminate the lease agreement will be met with vigorous legal opposition. It was perfect. Formal, professional, and subtly threatening. It made clear that Richard Castellano wasn't dealing with some helpless tenant he could bully. He was dealing with an entity that had resources and wasn't afraid to use them. Send it, I told Patricia. Certified mail, signature required. I want proof he received it. Already done. He'll have it tomorrow. That evening, I did something I'd been putting off. I went down to the building's lobby and knocked on the superintendent's apartment. His name was Luis, and he'd always been friendly to me in the casual way that building supers are friendly to quiet tenants who don't cause problems. He answered wearing a stained white t-shirt and holding a beer. Hey, Ms. Reeves. What's up? Can I ask you something? Has Mr. Castellano said anything to you about me? About wanting me to move out? Luis's expression shifted, becoming guarded. Why do you ask? Because I got an eviction notice yesterday, completely out of nowhere, and I'm trying to figure out what's going on. He glanced down the hallway, checking if anyone was listening, then stepped back and gestured for me to come in. His apartment was small but neat, decorated with family photos and a large crucifix on the wall. Look, he said quietly, I probably shouldn't tell you this, but yeah, Castellano's been talking about clearing out some of the long-term tenants. He wants to renovate apartments and jack up the rent. This whole building, he's trying to push out people who have older leases with lower rents. My rent is only $2,000 a month. What's he trying to charge for renovated apartments? $3,500, $40 if it's a corner unit. He's been systematically not renewing leases when they expire, offering cash buyouts to people who will leave voluntarily. Anyone who won't leave, he's been looking for excuses to evict them. So this is about money. He wants me out so he can get a higher-paying tenant. Yeah, but Ms. Reeves, you should know something else. You're not the first person in this building to get one of these eviction notices. He sent them to 3 other people in the last 6 months. All of them left. They couldn't afford to fight it, couldn't risk having an eviction on their record. They just packed up and moved. Did any of them actually violate their leases? No. He just made up reasons. One lady, he said, was causing noise complaints, but nobody ever complained about her. Another guy, he said, wasn't maintaining his apartment properly, but that was bullshit too. He's just trying to scare people into leaving. I felt my anger crystallize into something cold and determined. Richard Castellano was a bully who'd been getting away with pushing out vulnerable tenants because they didn't have the resources to fight back. He'd assumed I was the same. He'd made a serious miscalculation. Thank you for telling me this, Luis. I'm not going to mention that we talked, but this information helps a lot. You gonna fight him? Oh, I'm definitely going to fight him, and I'm going to win. Back in my apartment, I added Luis's information to my growing file of evidence. This wasn't just about my eviction anymore. This was about a pattern of behavior. If I could prove that Richard Castellano had been systematically harassing tenants with bogus eviction notices to force them out and raise rents, that was a much bigger legal problem for him than just my individual case. I spent the rest of the evening researching New York tenant law, reading cases about wrongful eviction, understanding exactly what rights I had and what remedies were available. The more I read, the more confident I became. Richard Castellano had messed up. Badly. The next afternoon, I got a phone call from a number I didn't recognize. I answered cautiously. Ms. Reeves, this is Robert Berkowitz from Berkowitz & Stein. We represent Richard Castellano in the matter of your tenancy at 247 Monroe Street. The lawyer. The one whose letterhead had been on the eviction notice. I'm listening. I wanted to reach out directly to discuss the situation. There seems to be some confusion about the terms of your lease. There's no confusion on my end. I have a valid lease. I've never violated it. This eviction notice is completely without merit. Mr. Castellano is concerned about unauthorized occupancy. There is no unauthorized occupancy. I live alone. I've always lived alone. This is a pretextual eviction attempt, and we both know it. There was a pause. I'm not sure what you mean by pretextual. I mean that Mr. Castellano wants to evict me so he can renovate my apartment and rent it for a higher price. He's been doing this to other tenants in the building, and now he's trying it with me. But unlike the other tenants, I have the resources to fight back. Did you read the response letter from my attorney? I did receive a letter from Patricia Song. That's actually why I'm calling. Mr. Castellano would like to resolve this matter amicably. Resolve it how? He's prepared to offer you a buyout. If you agree to vacate the apartment within 60 days, he'll pay you $15,000 and release you from the lease with no penalties. I laughed. Actually laughed out loud. $15,000? You think I'm going to give up my apartment for $15,000? It's a generous offer, Ms. Reeves. That's more than 6 months of rent. It's insulting. I have a valid lease for another year. The apartment is rent stabilized under New York law, and your client is trying to illegally evict me using a bogus claim. You know what's going to happen if I fight this? Ms. Reeves, I'm going to sue for wrongful eviction. I'm going to sue for harassment. I'm going to document every code violation in this building and report them to the city. I'm going to make this so expensive for your client that $15,000 will look like pocket change. Do you understand? Another pause. I'll convey your position to Mr. Castellano. You do that, and tell him that his next communication with me needs to come through my attorney. I'm done with direct contact. I hung up feeling exhilarated. I'd never spoken to a lawyer like that before. Never stood up for myself so aggressively. It felt good. It felt powerful. That evening, Patricia called me. I just got a call from Berkowitz. He says you rejected a settlement offer? $15,000 to move out. It was a joke. Good. Don't take anything less than 6 figures if you're going to settle. But honestly, I don't think you should settle. I think you should fight this and make an example of him. That's what I want to do. But can we actually win? Win? Jasmine, we're going to destroy him. I've been doing more research on Richard Castellano. He's done this to at least a dozen tenants in his buildings over the last 3 years. Bogus eviction notices, harassment, refusing to make repairs to force people out. There's a pattern of behavior here. And you know what? I think we should reach out to some of those other tenants. See if they want to join a class action lawsuit. A class action? Yeah. If we can get even 3 or 4 of those former tenants to join the case, we can show a pattern of predatory behavior. That massively increases the potential damages. We're not talking about settling for $15,000 anymore. We're talking about potentially millions in damages across all plaintiffs. Do it. Find those tenants. Build the case. I want Richard Castellano to regret ever sending me that eviction notice. Over the next 2 weeks, Patricia worked her magic. She tracked down 6 former tenants who'd been pushed out of Castellano's buildings through similar tactics. 3 of them agreed to join a class action lawsuit. She filed a formal complaint not just about my eviction notice, but about systematic tenant harassment and predatory rental practices. And then she did something brilliant. She sent a press release to local news outlets about the lawsuit. Within 24 hours, a Brooklyn newspaper ran a story. Landlord accused of systematic tenant harassment in eviction scheme. The article detailed the allegations, included quotes from Patricia and from 2 of the former tenants who'd agreed to go public with their stories. Suddenly, Richard Castellano wasn't just dealing with a legal problem. He was dealing with a public relations nightmare. My phone rang at 7 a.m. the day after the article came out. Robert Berkowitz again. Ms. Reeves, I need to speak with you urgently about resolving this matter. I thought I told you all communication goes through my attorney. Please? Mr. Castellano is very upset about the negative press. He wants to resolve this immediately. Then he should agree to drop the eviction notice, acknowledge in writing that I'm a tenant in good standing, and guarantee that my lease will be renewed at its current rate when it expires. He's prepared to do that. He's also prepared to offer you a settlement payment to compensate for any distress this has caused. How much? $50,000. I smiled. 2 weeks ago, they'd offered $15,000. Now it was $50,000. And we hadn't even gone to court yet. I'll discuss it with my attorney. But Mr. Berkowitz, tell your client that if he ever tries something like this again with me or with any other tenant in his buildings, I'll make sure the next newspaper article is even more damaging. Understood? Understood. Patricia called me an hour later. Berkowitz just called me with a settlement offer. $50,000, they drop the eviction, they renew your lease. What do you want to do? What do you think? I think we can get more if we push. But I also think you should consider what you actually want out of this. Do you want money? Or do you want to keep living in that apartment? I thought about it. I want both. I want them to pay for trying to bully me. But I also want to stay in my apartment. I like it there. And I'm not going to let some predatory landlord force me out. Then here's what I propose. We counter with $75,000 and a 5-year lease extension at your current rate. That locks in your rent for 5 more years and gives you significant compensation for their harassment. It also sends a message that they can't push you around. Do it. It took 3 more days of negotiation, but we settled at $75,000. Richard Castellano agreed to withdraw the eviction notice, to acknowledge in writing that I was a tenant in good standing with no lease violations, and to extend my lease for 5 years at my current rent of $2,000 a month. The settlement also included a clause that prohibited him from retaliating against me in any way, with significant financial penalties if he violated that term. The check arrived 2 weeks later, $75,000 made out to the Reeves Family Trust. I deposited it into the trust's account, added it to my investment portfolio, and felt a profound sense of satisfaction. I'd won. Not just won, I'd made Richard Castellano pay a substantial penalty for trying to bully me. And I'd helped establish legal precedent that might protect other tenants from similar harassment. But the story didn't end there. 3 months after the settlement, I got a call from Patricia. "You're not going to believe this. Castellano is selling his buildings." Selling them? Why? The publicity from our case scared off some of his investors. Plus, the city started investigating his properties for code violations and found a bunch of stuff he'd been ignoring. It's become too expensive for him to keep operating. He's liquidating. What happens to my lease? Your lease transfers to whoever buys the building, and you have all the same protections under the new owner. Actually, this might work out well for you. New ownership often means better maintenance and management. She was right. The building was purchased by a property management company that actually cared about upkeep. Within 6 months, they'd fixed the lobby door, replaced the ancient elevator, renovated the common areas. My apartment stayed exactly the same, but the building around it improved dramatically. And my rent stayed locked at $2,000 a month, while comparable apartments in the neighborhood were going for $3,500 or more. Over the 5-year lease term, that rent savings alone would be worth over $100,000. If you've stayed with me through this whole story, if you've heard about how a landlord tried to illegally evict me and ended up paying $75,000 for his mistake, I hope you learned something valuable. About knowing your rights, about standing up to bullies, about the importance of documenting everything, and about how having resources, even resources other people don't know you have, can completely change the power dynamic in situations where someone's trying to take advantage of you. A year after the settlement, I was still living in my apartment in Brooklyn, still working at my job in finance, still living modestly while my investment portfolio continued to grow. It was now worth close to $5 million, and almost nobody knew. But I'd learned something important through the eviction fight. Having money wasn't just about security or comfort, or being able to buy things. It was about options. It was about not being vulnerable to people who wanted to push you around. It was about being able to fight back when someone tried to take advantage of you. Richard Castellano had looked at me and seen a young woman living in a modest apartment, working a regular job, someone who probably couldn't afford a lawyer and wouldn't know her rights. He'd made assumptions based on appearances. He'd thought I was powerless. He'd been catastrophically wrong. One afternoon, about 18 months after the settlement, I ran into Luis, the superintendent, in the lobby. He was installing new mailboxes, part of the building's ongoing renovations under the new ownership. "Ms. Reeves, how you doing?" "I'm great, Luis. How are things with the new owners?" "Way better. They actually fix stuff when it breaks. They pay me on time. It's like night and day compared to Castellano. I heard he sold all his buildings." "Yeah. Word is he's in some financial trouble. That lawsuit you did, it opened up a can of worms. A bunch of other tenants started suing him too. Plus the city fines. He basically had to liquidate everything." "Good. He was a terrible landlord." "You know what, though?" Luis grinned. "He never figured it out, did he? About you." "What do you mean?" "About you having money. He thought you were just some regular tenant. He had no idea who he was messing with. That's the best part of the whole thing. He went after you thinking you couldn't fight back, and you destroyed him without him ever understanding why he lost." I smiled. "Some people make assumptions based on appearances. That's their mistake, not mine. You gonna stay in the neighborhood? I know you could probably afford something fancier now with that settlement money. I like it here. The rent's good, the apartment's fine, the location works for me. Why would I move?" He nodded approvingly. "Smart. You know what they say about people with real money? They don't need to show it off." That conversation stuck with me. Luis was right. I didn't need to show off my wealth. I didn't need a fancy apartment or an expensive car or designer clothes. I had something better. I had freedom. I had security. I had options that most people didn't have. And I had the satisfaction of knowing that when someone tried to bully me, I'd fought back and won. 2 years after the eviction attempt, I was thriving. My investment portfolio had crossed $6 million. I'd been promoted at work to senior analyst. I'd started dating someone I really liked, A teacher who had no idea I had money and loved me for who I was, not what I had. My life was good. I still lived in the same apartment in Brooklyn. Still paid $2,000 a month in rent while comparable units went for $4,000 or more. Still took the subway to work. Still dressed casually. Still lived below my means. But I'd learned important lessons from the eviction fight. About documentation and legal rights and the importance of having good lawyers. About standing up to bullies and not backing down when someone tries to intimidate you. About the value of keeping some cards close to your vest. And I'd learned that sometimes, the best revenge isn't making people know you beat them. It's beating them so thoroughly that they never even understand how they lost. Richard Castellano never knew about my $4 million investment portfolio. Never knew that I could have fought him for years without blinking at the legal costs. Never knew that the modest young tenant he tried to push around was actually someone with more resources than he'd imagined. He just knew that he'd tried to evict me. I'd fought back, and it had cost him $75,000 plus legal fees, plus the negative publicity that eventually forced him to sell his buildings. He knew he'd lost. He just didn't know why he'd lost so badly. And that, to me, was perfect. 3 years after the eviction notice appeared on my door, I got a piece of mail that made me smile. It was from the new building management company. They were offering long-term tenants the option to purchase their apartments at below-market rates as part of a conversion to condominiums. My apartment, which would normally sell for about $600,000 in the current Brooklyn market, was being offered to me for $450,000. A $15,000 discount as a thank you for being a long-term tenant in good standing. I called Robert Chen, my financial advisor. I have an investment opportunity. What do you think about buying a Brooklyn condo at below-market rates? He ran the numbers. It's a solid investment. Real estate in that neighborhood has been appreciating at about 7% annually. You'd be buying at a significant discount. Plus, you eliminate your rent payment and build equity. I say go for it. I bought the apartment. Paid cash from the trust. $450,000 wired directly to the closing attorney. Became a property owner at age 31. The closing attorney looked at the wire transfer confirmation and then at me, clearly trying to reconcile my casual jeans and sweatshirt with the ability to drop $450,000 in cash on an apartment purchase. Ms. Reeves, I have to say, I don't see many people your age buying properties outright with no mortgage. I've been saving, I said simply. You must be very good at saving. I'm very good at investing, actually. But thank you. After the closing, I walked back to my apartment that I now owned, and thought about the journey that had brought me here. From Detroit factory worker's daughter to Brooklyn property owner. From getting an eviction notice taped to my door to owning the door itself. I thought about Richard Castellano, wherever he was now, probably still wondering how a simple eviction had blown up so spectacularly in his face. Still not understanding that he'd picked a fight with someone who had resources he couldn't see. I thought about all the tenants who'd been pushed out of his buildings before me, who hadn't been able to fight back because they didn't have lawyers or money or knowledge of their rights. I thought about how easily I could have been one of them if I hadn't built my investment portfolio, if I hadn't structured my assets carefully, if I hadn't kept that lease writer with the trust name on it. And I thought about the lesson in all of this, that appearances are deceiving, that you shouldn't make assumptions about people based on how they live, and that sometimes the person you're trying to push around has more power than you could possibly imagine. 4 years after that eviction notice, my life looked almost exactly the same from the outside. I still worked my job in finance, still dressed casually, still took the subway. The only difference was that I now owned my apartment instead of renting it, but from the outside, nobody could tell. My investment portfolio had grown to $8 million. I was 35 years old and financially independent. I could retire tomorrow if I wanted to. I could buy a mansion. I could buy a Ferrari. I could do a lot of things. But I liked my life the way it was. Quiet, private, comfortable but not ostentatious. I'd learned from my parents that happiness doesn't come from showing off what you have. It comes from having the freedom to live life on your own terms. And I had that freedom because I'd been smart about building wealth, about protecting it, about keeping it private. And because when someone had tried to take advantage of that privacy, had assumed I was powerless because I lived modestly, I'd been able to fight back in ways they never saw coming. I never saw Richard Castellano again after the settlement. But I heard through the building grapevine that he'd declared bankruptcy about a year after selling his properties. The lawsuits and fines and legal fees had caught up with him. He'd lost everything because he'd been too greedy, too willing to hurt vulnerable people to make an extra buck. Meanwhile, I was thriving, building wealth, living well, and sleeping soundly in an apartment I owned, in a building where my rent would never go up, in a neighborhood I loved. Sometimes I think about that eviction notice, about how angry and scared I'd been when I first saw it, about how it had felt like an attack, an injustice, a violation of my rights. And then I think about how that same eviction notice had led to a $75,000 settlement, to legal protections that gave me leverage to buy my apartment at below-market rates, to the downfall of a predatory landlord, and to a valuable lesson about standing up for yourself. That eviction notice, meant to push me out and make me powerless, had actually made me stronger. It had taught me that I had the resources to fight back, that I didn't have to accept injustice just because someone in a position of power tried to impose it on me, that having money wasn't just about buying things, it was about having options, having power, having the ability to say no when someone tried to take advantage of you. So hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this is the story we all need to hear. About someone who looked powerless but wasn't. About someone who kept their resources private until the moment they needed to use them. About someone who fought back against a bully and won decisively. I'm Jasmine Reeves. I'm 35 years old. I own my apartment in Brooklyn. I have $8 million in investments that almost nobody knows about. I work a job I enjoy. I live the life I want to live. And I learned, through an illegal eviction attempt that backfired spectacularly, that sometimes the best power is the power nobody knows you have. Because when people underestimate you, when they make assumptions based on appearances, when they think you can't fight back, that's when you have the biggest advantage. That's when you can surprise them. That's when you can win. Richard Castellano thought he was pushing around a powerless tenant. Instead, he got destroyed by someone who had resources he never imagined, who knew her rights better than he knew his, who documented everything and fought back strategically and won decisively. And the best part? He never knew why he lost. He just knew that he tried to evict someone he thought was vulnerable, and it ended up costing him everything. That's the power of keeping your cards close to your vest. That's the value of building wealth privately. That's what happens when you're underestimated by someone who should have known better. The landlord slipped an eviction notice under my door. The lease writer with my trust name shut him up, shut him down, and eventually shut down his entire operation. And I'm still here, in my apartment that I now own, living my quiet life, building my wealth, and knowing that if anyone ever tries to push me around again, I have the resources to fight back. That's my story. That's my truth. That's what I learned when someone tried to illegally evict me and ended up paying $75,000 for their mistake. Never judge a book by its cover. Never assume someone is powerless just because they live modestly. And never ever try to push around someone without knowing what resources they might have to push back. Because you might just find out the hard way that appearances are deceiving, that quiet people can be dangerous when provoked, and that sometimes the person you're trying to evict is actually the one who ends up owning the building.